Nobody in that store knew what was about to happen, and honestly, neither did the man who started it. A convenience store. Los Angeles. Tuesday afternoon. Humming fluorescent lights. Cold drinks behind glass doors. A cashier scrolling through her phone, on what should have been the most forgettable shift of her week. Then 3 men walked in, loud, swaggering, taking up every inch of space they hadn't been offered. They moved through the aisles like the store belonged to them, knocking things sideways, talking over each other, filling the room with the particular energy of people who have never once been told to lower their voice. Nobody said anything. Nobody ever did. That's when the door opened again. A man walked in quietly. No entourage, no security, no design or anything. Plain gray sweatshirt, dark jeans, worn boots, hair pulled loosely back. He went straight to the fridge, picked up a bottle of water, moved toward the counter without looking at anyone. One of the 3 men spotted him, looked him up and down, took in the sweatshirt, the boots, the quiet. He nudged his friend and smiled. "Hey, old man." The man kept walking. "I'm talking to you." Nothing. The leader stepped forward now, shoulders back, chin out, moving with the slow, deliberate confidence of someone who had done this 100 times, and it had always worked. He got close. Too close. "You deaf? Or just dumb?" The store went completely still. The cashier froze. A woman near the entrance grabbed her child's hand without thinking. An older gentleman near the back took one quiet step away from the aisle, and the man in the gray sweatshirt stopped, turned around, slowly. No anger, no fear, no urgency of any kind. He looked at the man in front of him, the way someone looks at a situation they have already finished calculating. He said nothing. And that silence, that complete, total, unbothered silence, changed the temperature of the entire room. Because what that thug didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the man standing in front of them was one of the most dangerous human beings on the planet, and he was holding a bottle of water. What would you have done in that moment? Said something, or stayed quiet? Tell us below. To understand what was about to happen in that store, you first have to understand who Steven Seagal actually is. Not the version on a movie poster. Not the action star in the black t-shirt, the real one. Steven Seagal was born in 1952 in Lansing, Michigan, restless kid, sensitive. The kind of child who felt everything too deeply and had nowhere to put any of it. His family moved to California, and somewhere in the suburbs of Fullerton, a teenage Seagal walked into a martial arts dojo for the first time, and something inside him completely woke up. He didn't just learn Aikido, he disappeared into it. Aikido is not about aggression. It is not about hitting harder than the other person. It is about redirection, about using an opponent's own force, their own weight, their own momentum, and turning it against them. The more energy someone brings toward you, the more dangerous you become. By his early 20s, Seagal had done something almost no Westerner had done before. He moved to Japan, not as a visitor, not for a short program. He lived there, trained there daily, and eventually opened his own dojo in Osaka, becoming the first foreigner in history to operate an Aikido dojo in Japan. A country that had practiced this art for generations opened that door for him, because he had earned it. He trained alongside people whose names do not appear in any public record. Law enforcement, intelligence operatives, people whose profession was being the most capable individual in any room they entered. He returned to the United States not as a student. As a master, he consulted for the Los Angeles Police Department. He advised on use of force techniques. He was certified by law enforcement agencies most civilians have never heard of. He served as a working reserve deputy sheriff, not ceremonially, but in the field. Here is the thing about people who reach that level of genuine skill, and this is something most people fundamentally misunderstand. The more dangerous a person truly is, the less they feel the need to prove it. A man who has never been in a real confrontation wants the room to know he can handle one. A man who has handled more than most people will ever know about doesn't need to say a single word. He had been in that store before, many times. The owner knew him by name. They had shared tea in the back room. He was not there to impress anyone. He was not there to be recognized. He was thirsty. That was all. But 3 young men had walked through the same door that same afternoon, carrying the specific, brittle arrogance of people who had never met a real consequence and chosen him. Of every person in that store, they chose him. Have you ever judged someone completely wrong just by looking at them? What happened? The leader of the group we'll call him Marcus, was 26 years old, 6'2", built wide, street hardened. He had been in enough confrontations to believe that size and volume were the only tools a man ever needed. He had never once been proven wrong, and that, more than his size, more than his anger, was what made him genuinely dangerous. Not skill, certainty, the unshakable certainty that he already knew how this played out. "I asked you a question," Marcus said. His voice had dropped now, slower, more deliberate, the specific tone people use when they want the room to understand that the next few moments are serious. The man looked at him, calm, unhurried, as if Marcus had not yet said anything worth changing his expression for. "You don't want this conversation," the man said simply. Not a threat, a statement. The kind that carries more weight than the words themselves. Marcus laughed. His friends laughed behind him. "Oh yeah? And why is that?" The man turned back toward the counter. "Because it ends badly for you." Something shifted in Marcus's face. Not anger, not exactly. Something closer to offense. The specific discomfort of someone refusing to play the role you have already assigned them. This is worth understanding. When we intimidate someone and it works, when they flinch, they apologize, they make themselves smaller, our brain registers relief. The script ran as expected. But when someone doesn't comply, when they stay completely calm, completely unimpressed, completely unbothered, the brain reads it as a threat. Not because anything dangerous has happened yet, but because the script has been broken, and people who only know one script become desperate quickly to force the situation back to something familiar. Marcus reached out, grabbed the man's shoulder, hard, spun him around. "Don't walk away from me." The cashier moved to the far end of her counter. Her hand hovered near the phone. The older gentleman from the bread aisle took 2 more steps back without looking away. One of Marcus's friends shifted quietly to the exit. Not because anyone signaled him to, but because they had done this before, and they all knew the positions by instinct. Block the door. Cut off the exit. Let Marcus work. This was the moment most people collapsed. Hands up, voice soft, apologies arriving before they were even demanded. The body doing whatever it takes to signal, "I am not a threat. Please stop. That is not weakness. That is the human nervous system, doing exactly what it evolved to do, calculating, in a fraction of a second, that making yourself small costs less than what comes next." Most people in that situation make exactly that calculation. But the man in the gray sweatshirt did something none of them had seen before. He smiled, not nervously, not to soften the room, quietly, privately. The smile of someone who has just been handed exactly the situation they know precisely how to handle. "Okay," he said softly, and then he simply stood there, still, no shifting of weight, no scanning of exits, no visible calculation happening at all. And that stillness, that absolute, rooted stillness, was somehow more unsettling to Marcus than any reaction he had prepared for, because Marcus was used to being the most dangerous presence in any room, and for the first time, standing 2 feet away from a man in a plain gray sweatshirt, he felt something crawling into his chest that he did not have a name for. The man was not afraid of him, not performing calm, not managing his breathing, not holding himself together. He genuinely, completely, did not appear to register Marcus as a threat, which meant one of 2 things. He had no idea what he was standing in the middle of, or he knew something Marcus didn't. Marcus tightened his grip on the man's shoulder. "You think this is funny, old man? I think," the man said quietly, "that you've made this decision without having all the information." What information? One pause, long and deliberate. That would ruin the surprise. At what point in this story did you feel the shift? When did you know Marcus had made a serious mistake? Marcus pulled him forward, and that was the moment everything changed. What happened in the next 11 seconds was described afterward by 3 separate witnesses, using almost identical words. It was like watching water move. No big swing, no dramatic wind-up, no movie-style exchange of blows, where both men throw punches, and the better man wins on points. None of that. The man simply shifted. One hand redirected Marcus's grip. One foot moved, barely 6 inches, and Marcus, 220 pounds of muscle and forward momentum, found himself no longer standing. He was on the floor, face down, his arm pinned behind him, at an angle that made any movement immediately and precisely painful. The entire thing had taken less time than it takes to blink twice. His 2 friends did not move, not toward the man, not toward the door, not toward Marcus. They stood exactly where they were, because watching it happen in real time had delivered information that their bodies processed before their minds caught up. This was not luck. This was not a desperate reaction. This was not a man swinging and connecting. This was someone who had done this 10,000 times before. The difference is visible. You cannot fake that kind of economy of movement. You cannot rehearse that kind of calm. It either lives in the body or it doesn't. Marcus tried to shift his weight. The pressure on his arm increased immediately. He stopped. "I'm going to release you," the man said. Same voice, same pace, not a trace of satisfaction, not a trace of anger, as if what had just happened was the most ordinary thing in the world. "When I do, you stand up slowly, and you leave, all three of you." Silence. Understood. Nothing from Marcus. The pressure returned, controlled and deliberate. Understood.
Yeah.
The voice that came out of Marcus was thin, stripped of everything that had been in it 20 minutes earlier. Good. The man released him and stepped back. Marcus stood up slowly. He didn't look at his friends. He didn't look at the cashier. He didn't look at the man who had just put him on the floor. Because there is a specific kind of moment that removes everything. The performance, the reputation, the identity built carefully, over years of being the loudest person in the room, and leaves someone standing, as simply, plainly, exactly who they are underneath all of it. Marcus walked to the door. Its friends followed. It swung shut behind them. The store exhaled. The cashier, a young woman named Deja, stood very still behind her counter for a moment. Then she looked at the man. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked. She almost laughed. "Am I?" she started. "You just..." She stopped, started again. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said simply. He set his water on the counter. Placed a few bills down without counting them. "Keep the change." He was almost at the door when the older gentleman from the bread aisle said something quietly. The man paused.
"You're Steven Seagal, a beat."
"One single beat."
"I am,"
he said. Deja's hand went still. She had watched those films with her father on Saturday afternoons growing up, Under Siege, Above the Law, Hard to Kill. This quiet man in worn boots who had folded Marcus, like the whole thing was an inconvenience, had been standing in her store for 15 minutes. And she had not recognized him once. "Why didn't you just tell him who you were?" she asked. He paused at the door. Thought about it for a moment. "Because it shouldn't matter," he said. "If someone only treats you with respect, because of your name, that's not respect." He pushed the door open. That's fear with better manners. He walked out into the afternoon, quietly, the same way he had arrived. And for a long moment, nobody in that store said anything at all. Which line hit you the hardest, and why? Drop it in the comments. Now, here is the part most people never heard. Because the story that circulated online, the clip, the comments, the shares, focused entirely on 11 seconds. What no one talked about was what those 11 seconds uncovered. There was a man sitting in the corner booth, near the window, the entire time. His name was Gerald. He came into that store every afternoon. Same time, same coffee, same seat by the window. He had filmed the confrontation, not for social media, not for any public reason, but because he recognized Marcus. Not from the neighborhood, from a case file. Gerald was a retired investigator who had spent 20 years working financial fraud and organized intimidation. And Marcus, despite everything about his appearance that afternoon, was connected to a network that had been running a protection scheme across that 6-block radius for nearly 4 years. Small businesses, immigrant-owned stores, the kind of places that run on thin margins and cannot afford the attention that comes with filing a police report. The store owner, a man named Paul, who had emigrated from South Korea, in the early 90s had been paying a weekly fee to Marcus's crew for the past 18 months. Not because he had agreed to it, because the alternative had been made very clear to him. His daughter worked the Sunday morning shift. Marcus's associates had walked past her on 3 separate occasions. Slowly, without a word. Just presence. Just the quiet communication that they knew her schedule. Paul had made the calculation that far too many small business owners are silently forced to make. It is cheaper to pay than to fight. Gerald sent the footage that evening to a former colleague still active in law enforcement. 3 minutes and 12 seconds of video that showed not just the confrontation, but Marcus's voice, clearly audible in the moments before it, referencing Paul by name and the payment he was late on. That footage reached a detective who had been building a case against the same network for 8 months. The detective later described it as the thread we had been looking for. Marcus had not walked into that store by accident. He had not chosen that afternoon randomly. He was there because Paul was 2 weeks late. He was there to remind Paul what the consequences of being late looked like. He had chosen the wrong afternoon. He had chosen a store where a retired investigator happened to be sitting by the window, where a cashier happened to stay at her counter when most people would have stepped back, and where a man in a gray sweatshirt happened to want a bottle of water on a Tuesday afternoon. None of those things were planned. None of them were coordinated. They simply all arrived in the same room at the same time. This is the thing about accountability. It rarely arrives the way we imagine it will. We picture dramatic investigations, formal processes, deliberate, organized justice moving in a straight line. But in reality, it often arrives sideways, through a corner booth, through a phone pointed at the right moment, through a retired man who recognized a face and decided that his afternoon coffee could wait 5 minutes while he made a phone call. Marcus had spent 4 years operating on the assumption that silence was permanent, that people who were afraid stayed afraid, that no one was ever watching. He had never considered that the man he chose to humiliate in a convenience store on a Tuesday afternoon would be the reason everything unraveled. Do you think Marcus ever imagined that moment in the store would cost him everything, or did he never see it coming? Steven Seagal found out about the footage the same way most people did. Someone sent him a link. He watched it again, and then he did something that surprised the people around him. He asked for Paul's contact information, not through a publicist, not through any formal channel. He called Paul directly. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Paul, who had not spoken openly about the payments, to anyone, not his wife, not his children, not the friend he had known for 30 years, found himself telling a stranger on the phone everything. The fear that had become so familiar, he had stopped recognizing it as fear. The shame that had quietly rewritten the story, turning something that was done to him into something that felt like his failure. The way he had started to believe that this was simply the cost of building something in a city that had stopped protecting people like him. Shame does this. It does not arrive loudly. It arrives slowly, replacing the accurate version of events with a distorted one, where you are somehow responsible for the thing that was done to you. You should have been smarter. You should have been stronger. You should have seen it coming. And so you carry it quietly, because carrying it quietly feels safer than letting anyone else see what you were not strong enough to prevent. Paul had carried it for 18 months. You are not alone in this, Seagal told him, and you did nothing wrong. 2 sentences, no performance in them, no camera rolling, no audience, just one person saying plainly to another, this was done to you. You are not the one who failed. Paul would say later that those 2 sentences were the first time in a year and a half that the weight had shifted, not disappeared, just shifted, enough to consider that speaking might cost less than he had been calculating. He spoke, and when investigators began reaching out to other businesses on the same block, they found that Paul was not alone, not remotely. Multiple business owners, the same fear, the same payments, the same carefully maintained silence. Each person kept separate, each person made to believe they were the only one. That is how this kind of system sustains itself, not through constant visible violence, through isolation, through making every person feel that if they speak alone. Paul speaking meant others could speak, and others speaking meant the case that had been building for 8 months suddenly had everything it needed. Marcus and 2 associates were arrested 6 weeks after the footage surfaced. The charges were serious: extortion, conspiracy, organized intimidation, not because of a dramatic operation, not because of years of additional investigation, because Gerald had his phone out, because Deja stayed at her counter, because Paul finally spoke, because one man had gone into a store for a bottle of water and refused, quietly, completely, to be made smaller. None of those things alone was enough. Every single one of them together was everything. At sentencing, Marcus was given the opportunity to speak. He stood up. He looked different from the man who had grabbed a stranger's shoulder in that store, smaller, not physically, but in the specific way people shrink when the performance finally runs out and there is nothing left underneath it. I thought making people afraid of me was the same as being respected, he said. He paused. It's not. I know that now. I just learned it, in the worst possible way. The judge noted his statement, then delivered the sentence. Between Paul finally speaking and Marcus's words at sentencing, which moment do you think took more courage? There is a version of this story that is easy to tell. Big action star, foolish thug, 11 seconds, crowd goes wild. That version is satisfying, but it misses everything that actually matters. The real story is Paul. The real story is a man who carried 18 months of shame for something that was never his fault, and finally put it down because someone called him and said two plain sentences. The real story is Deja, who stayed at her counter when every instinct said step back, and gave a full statement afterward, because it was the right thing to do. The real story is Gerald, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee, who could have watched what happened, shaken his head, and driven home. He didn't. The most powerful thing Steven Seagal did that afternoon was not the 11 seconds on the floor. It was the 40-minute phone call, because the 11 seconds ended a moment. The phone call changed a life, and one life changing gave others permission to change alongside it. We celebrate the visible things, the confrontation, the clip, the moment that can be captured, shared, and replayed from the beginning, but real change almost never lives in those moments. It lives in the invisible ones, the phone call no one sees, the statement given when no one required it, the retired investigator who stayed an extra 5 minutes before going home, the business owner who finally decides that the cost of speaking is lower than the cost of carrying it one more day. Here is what this story is actually about. Real strength is quiet, not because quiet people are passive, but because people who have genuinely built something in their body, in their character, in their understanding of who they are, do not need the room to confirm it. They are not performing for anyone. They move through the world as exactly who they are, and sometimes exactly who they are walks into a convenience store on a Tuesday afternoon and changes everything, not by announcing themselves, but simply by refusing to become less than themselves when someone asks them to. The person who mistakes silence for weakness will eventually meet the wrong silence. The person who mistakes worn boots for irrelevance will eventually be corrected by the floor. And the person who builds their identity entirely on making others afraid will eventually discover that fear is not loyalty, intimidation is not respect, and the silence they created was never going to be permanent. Steven Seagal walked into a store for water. He walked out having started something none of them planned, a chain of small unglamorous decisions made by ordinary people who chose at the right moment to do the right thing. Gerald, Deja, Paul, none of them made headlines. All of them made the outcome possible. That is how real change actually moves through the world. Not in dramatic moments, in small ones, chosen carefully, by people who decided that staying quiet cost more than speaking. A thought to carry with you: respect is not owed to titles. It is not earned by volume or size, or the number of people who are afraid of your name. Real respect, the kind that means something, belongs to character. And character is not what you show when the room is watching. It is what remains when you believe no one is. In that store, on that Tuesday, every person in that room showed exactly who they were when they thought it didn't matter. Some of them were right, some of them were not. Female CTA, if any part of this story stayed with you longer than you expected, we want to know which part. Was it the 40-minute phone call? Was it Deja staying at her counter? Was it Marcus's words at sentencing? Or was it something quieter, something between the lines, that you're still turning over right now? Tell us in the comments, because your answers genuinely shape what we bring you next. There are more stories coming, stories like this one, about ordinary moments that turned out to be much larger than they appeared, about quiet people who were anything but weak, about strength that never once announced itself. Make sure you're here for them. And if someone in your life needs the reminder that the quietest person in the room is often the most prepared, share this with them today.